Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we are taking a deep dive into the mind of one of the absolute most influential thinkers in human history, Immanuel Kant. We're going to explore his quest for the ultimate, unshakable moral law. You see, Kant didn't just want to know what was, practically good for society or what made people happy. He wanted to uncover a foundational rule of morality that applies to every single rational being, everywhere, without exception. It's a really rigorous, honestly fascinating framework, and we're going to break the whole thing down step by step.
But hey, before we get into the mechanics of it all, let me hook you with this famous, incredibly high-stakes dilemma. Imagine you are hiding an innocent friend in your house. Suddenly, a would-be murderer knocks on your door and asks point blank if your friend is inside. What do? I mean, common sense and honestly most other ethical theories scream at you to just lie. But for Kant, lying is categorically wrong, even in this extreme scenario. You cannot lie, not even to a murderer. Now, why on earth would a brilliant philosopher advocate for something so seemingly rigid? Well, that intensity, that absolute nature of his moral framework is exactly what we're going to unpack today.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap. 1. Foundation, the goodwill. 2. Categorical versus hypothetical imperatives. 3. The tests of morality. 4. Categorizing duties. And 5. Kant's modern moral legacy. All right, starting right at the bedrock, Section 1, Foundation, the goodwill. Kant argued that pretty much everything we typically think of as good, things like intelligence, courage, or wealth, can actually be used for evil. I mean, think about it. A highly intelligent, courageous bank robber is a way worse threat than a foolish one, right? So the only thing in the universe that is good in and of itself, without any qualification whatsoever, is a goodwill. And for Kant, having a goodwill means acting entirely out of duty. That means doing the right thing simply because it is the right thing. You're doing it out of sheer respect for the moral law, and not because of how it might eventually benefit you.
So, how does this actually work? Well, Kant recognized that as humans, we're constantly pulled by our natural biological desires. To explain how we can act purely from duty, he kind of split our reality. He argued we actually occupy two worlds at once. First, there's the phenomenal world, the everyday world of science and cause and effect, where our bodily desires live. But then there is also the noumenal or intelligible world. This is the abstract realm of pure, rational free will. Kant believed that because we possess rational minds, we can tap into this noumenal world and freely choose to follow moral laws, rather than just being pushed around by our animal instincts.
Moving on to Section 2, Categorical versus hypothetical imperatives.
So think of an imperative as just a fancy word for a command. Kant said there are basically two types. The first is hypothetical. These are conditional commands based entirely on our desires. Like, if you want to pass the exam, then you must study. Or, if you want pastrami, go to the deli. If you abandon the goal, say you just drop the class, the command disappears. It literally no longer applies to you. But morality? Kant argues morality cannot be like that. Morality isn't optional just because of what you happen to want today. That's why true moral laws must be categorical. They are unconditional. They don't say, if you want to be a good person, don't steal. They simply say, do not steal, full stop.
This brings us to the big one, the categorical imperative. This is the supreme principle of morality in Kant's eyes. It is objective, it's rationally necessary, and it is completely unconditional. It applies to us simply because we are rational agents. It does not care about your specific culture, your personal goals, or your shifting moods. If a rule passes the test of the categorical imperative, it is your moral duty to follow it, even if every fiber of your being wants to do something else.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 3, the tests of morality.
Kant gives us formulations to actually test our actions. The first, and probably most famous, is the formula of universal law. It's a pretty straightforward three-step test. Step 1, formulate your maxim. That's your underlying personal rule. For example, I'm going to make a lying promise to get a loan I know I won't repay. Step 2, recast that as a universal law of nature. Imagine a world where literally everyone, every single time they need money, makes a lying promise. Step 3, check for contradiction. If everyone lies to get loans, the very concept of a promise just breaks down entirely, right? No one would ever lend money, making your original plan impossible to even execute. Because the maxim contradicts itself when universalized, Kant says the action is morally forbidden. It's just inherently irrational. Now, the second formulation shifts gears a bit from logic to human dignity. It's known as the formula of humanity. Let's really emphasize this exact wording. So act that you use humanity always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. Notice Kant isn't saying you can never use a person to get something done. When you buy coffee, you use the barista as a means to get caffeine. And that's totally fine. The absolute keyword here is merely. You cross the moral line when you treat someone only as a tool, completely overriding their own rational agency. If you lie to someone to get their money, you've hijacked their ability to make a rational choice. You basically strip them of their dignity as an autonomous being.
Now, philosophers love to heavily debate exactly what treating someone merely as a means actually entails in practice. One prominent academic approach, advanced by thinkers like Christine Korsgaard and Honora O'Neill, is what's called the possible consent interpretation. They suggest you treat someone as a mere means if you treat them in a way they could not possibly consent to, like deceiving them because they literally don't know what they're agreeing to. However, as scholars like Japa Palakathiel point out, this interpretation creates some real tension. Why? Well, because Kant himself supported the state's use of force to punish criminals, and obviously a criminal generally doesn't consent to being thrown in jail. This ongoing debate just shows how rich and challenging applying Kant's framework can be. The third formulation kind of ties the first two together into what he calls the kingdom of ends. Kant asks us to imagine acting as if we are members of a moral community made up entirely of free, equal, self-governing rational agents. In this kingdom, everyone makes universal laws and everyone is subject to those exact same laws. It's a really beautiful vision of autonomy, honestly. You aren't just following rules handed down by a king or by society. Through your own reason, you are co-authoring the moral law alongside all other human beings.
All right, let's jump into Section 4, Categorizing Duties.
Kant actually splits our obligations into perfect and imperfect duties. A perfect duty is negative. It tells you what not to do, and it allows absolutely zero exceptions. This comes from maxims that create that logical contradiction we talked about, like the lying promise. Now, an imperfect duty is positive. It tells you what you should do, but it allows flexibility in exactly how and when you do it. This stems from a contradiction in will. For example, a world where no one ever helps anyone else is logically conceivable, sure, but no rational person would actually will to live there because, well, we all eventually need help. Therefore, we have an imperfect duty to help others.
And this brilliantly illustrates the complete system Kant built. He basically created this exhaustive four-part grid. Starting on the top left, a perfect duty towards yourself is to refrain from suicide, because destroying your own rational nature to avoid pain is treating yourself merely as a means to an end. Now over on the top right, a perfect duty towards others is to make no lying promises. Down on the bottom left, an imperfect duty to yourself is to develop your natural talents. A rational being shouldn't just let their gifts rust. And finally, on the bottom right, an imperfect duty towards others is to contribute to charity. You know, you don't have to give all your money away constantly, but you must adopt the general policy of helping.
Finally, let's look at Section 5, Kant's modern moral legacy.
You know, Kant's ideas really triggered a massive paradigm shift by pulling ethics away from just looking at the outcomes of our actions and forcing us to look at the intrinsic dignity of rational beings. He essentially laid the philosophical bedrock for modern human rights. Whenever we argue that a person has fundamental rights that cannot be violated for the greater good, we are literally speaking Kant's language of autonomy and equality. And fascinatingly, his highly structured rule-based ethics is being used right now to build frameworks for artificial intelligence. Programmers are actively debating how to hardwire AI systems with categorical rules regarding lying, manipulation, and basic respect for humanity. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative question. If, as Kant argued, our moral rules must be unconditional and universal, remember, you can't even lie to the murderer at the door, how on earth do we program an AI to navigate a complex, highly imperfect, and nuanced human world? Can a machine possess a good will? Kant's rigorous logic continues to challenge us today, forcing us to ask what it truly means to be a rational, moral agent in the modern age. Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer. I really hope you walk away seeing the rules of right and wrong in a totally new light.